The smell hit first roasted turkey-buttered rolls, the sweet cinnamon hush of pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. The dining room glowed under a brass chandelier, every crystal drop catching light like a frost-tipped branch. My mother's oak table was already dressed in the good china, and ironed napkins, name cards tucked into little brass leaves. And just beyond the archway, I heard her voice, steady, practical, like she was discussing oven temperatures instead of children. "Amanda's kids eat first at the main table," she said. "Selena's can wait for what's left." I stood inside the doorway and didn't move. My coat hung open. My daughter's handmade card slid a little in my hand. In the den away from the glow and the good silverware, my two were perched on a wobbly folding table with mismatched plates, those old floral ones Mom always meant to donate. Morgan sat with her ankles crossed like I'd taught her. Ethan swung his feet just shy of the floor, both of them watching their cousins whirl brand new toys through the air. The drone's blades hissed. The television murmured. Somewhere, a timer dinged. Amanda lifted her champagne flute and laughed. "Get used to it," she said, eyes skating over my children without stopping. "Some folks are born to live off what's left." For a second, the chandelier hummed louder than anything. I could hear my own pulse. Ethan's backpack, green with dinosaurs, was tucked under his chair, like he didn't want it to get in anyone's way. Morgan kept her palm over his small hand, covering smaller, like a quiet umbrella. "Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, down in the comments. And if you've ever watched someone you love be treated like they didn't count, tap the like button, share this with a friend who'll understand, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next." But to understand how that dinner turned a page I couldn't turn back, you need to know what came before the doorbell, and the smell of rolls and the words that split the room in two. My name is Selena Hart. I was born second and taught to be grateful. Gratitude is a good thing. It keeps you steady when the wind comes up. But it can also be a bit you hold between your teeth, something you learn to bite down on so you don't make noise. My sister Amanda was the investment private school summer intensives, the right shoes, the better violin. I was the resourceful one, public school scholarships, you'll figure it out. When there was one seat by the window, it was hers. When there were two, I learned to like the aisle. I married young and worked hard. I became an accountant because numbers line up when people won't. When the marriage cracked quiet at first, then loud, I was the one who kept the lights on and packed the lunches. I learned the long geography between daytime spreadsheets and nighttime shifts pouring coffee. I learned how a child sleeps heavier when you rub slow circles on their back, and how to make chicken and rice feel like Sunday supper if you add a little lemon and light a candle. I learned most of all that there are words you never say in front of children, less than not worthy, wait your turn to be loved. We arrived on time like the text said. My father opened the door with a wine glass in his hand and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The entryway smelled like orange peel and a cleaner that promised holiday pine. My mother's hair didn't shift when she turned. It never does on holidays. "Set the kids' table in the den," she said, pressing mismatched plates into my hands. "We've got the main table covered. The kids' table I asked because 13 Thanksgivings had never needed two." She and Amanda exchanged a look across the island like a train passing a signal. My father came in and set a bowl of emerald beans down by the carving board. "It's efficient," he said, as if sorting children were the same as organizing side dishes. "Amanda's 3 have activities in the morning. They need proper fuel. And mine don't eat?" I heard my voice from down a hallway, a thin thing stretched between rooms. "Don't start," Amanda said, lifting her glass. "Let's not make this one of your speeches." In the living room, Zoe steered the drone with her phone, and Tyler wore a virtual reality headset that made him tilt like a sapling in wind. Lily's new electronic pet blinked to her voice. The drone cut a neat circle above the rug. Ethan leaned forward from his folding table. "It looks real," he whispered, almost to himself. Morgan touched his elbow. Wait. I set those plates down and went back to the kitchen. The turkey skin looked like lacquered chestnut, glossy and precise. The rolls were domed clouds. The gravy, thick as velvet, waited in a silver boat that we only see between November and Christmas. Is it true? I asked. The knives paused, the drone whirred, and the old house seemed to hold its breath. Amanda's kids at the main table and mine in the den with whatever you don't eat. My mother didn't look up. Selena, don't be dramatic. We're doing what makes sense. What makes sense? Amanda echoed, tapping her nails against the stem of her glass. Refined palates, proper nutrition. You know. Out in the doorway, Ethan shifted on his chair. Morgan watched the hallway, reading weather off faces like sky. Your children are used to simple food, my mother added, like she was choosing a dress pattern. They won't care about white meat versus dark, or truffle gravy versus regular. I thought of Morgan's careful drawings, the way she selects a single pencil and sits without moving until the shading under a cheekbone looks like it could breathe. I thought of Ethan naming dinosaurs more easily than days of the week, and how he warms his hands on a mug of cocoa like it's a small fire. I pictured them at that folding table with its uneven leg, waiting, always waiting, while their cousins learn how to be served first. I thought of the small cost of that lesson paid repeatedly in a currency children shouldn't have to know. We moved into the dining room when my mother called. The chandelier held its light like a promise. 6 name cards lined the main table: Martha Richard, Amanda Thomas, Zoe Tyler, with lilies perched beside a water goblet stacked with ice. In the corner, the card table waited with 2 floral plates from another decade. Ethan Morgan, my mother said, pointing. We'll fix your plates after everyone's is ready. Grandma, Ethan asked, peeking around my leg. Can't we sit with you? There isn't room, she said, smoothing a linen napkin. Grown-up conversation tonight. The carving knife ran through the breast meat in even slices. The serving spoons made soft clinks against porcelain. Amanda directed portions like a boss at a board table. White meat for Zoe, extra gravy for Tyler. He has practice. Lily wants the roll with sesame. She won't eat one without sesame. Thomas watched, said nothing, and shifted his phone face down on the table. A plate slid toward me, brown edges, dark meat, congealed gravy starting to skin. My mother's hand hovered. Here, she said matter-of-factly, nodding toward the den. They can share? There's a lesson in that. My father leaned back, satisfied, like a judge delivering a sentence that fit the crime. In life, you get what you earn. I stared at the plate. The gravy ringed the meat like a low tide line. The table hummed, and the house hummed, and the dull, embarrassed heat at the back of my neck hummed. I turned, and everything sharpened. Morgan's small shoulders squared. Ethan's mouth just barely opened the curve of his backpack strap against the chair. Hey, Tyler, called from the living room voice, muffled under the headset. That's my drone. Don't touch it with your grubby hands. Morgan's cheeks lifted a shade. Not crying, just color rising like the first bloom under frost. I was only looking, she said. You break it, you buy it, Zoe chimed, quick and bright. Oh, wait. Amanda smiled without showing teeth. Children repeat what they hear, she said, as if it were an admirable trait. Something small in me leaned on the inside of my ribs, like it wanted out. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a speech. It was quieter than that, steadier. I set the plate on the sideboard so the gravy wouldn't slide and took a breath that went all the way down. Before Thanksgiving, I'd given myself a little talk in the car. Be gracious. Be firm if you need to. Don't make a scene. Keep the peace. That's what decent people do on holidays. That's what I've always done. Iron everything flat with politeness and hope the creases don't show in the pictures. But the thing about peace is it can't be built on somebody's back. Not for long. Maybe if you'd done better in life, my father said, casual as salt. Your kids wouldn't have to learn the hard way. Ethan's eyes slid from the plate to my face. One tear tracked down without sound, slow as a bead rolling under glass. Mom, he whispered, voice small enough to fit in my pocket. Did I do something wrong? No, I said, but the word came out like fog on cold glass, visible and thin. Amanda laughed, not loud. She would never be loud in front of the good Crystal. Always so sensitive, Selena. This is a holiday. Be grateful. I looked at my mother, her knife poised above the last neat row of white meat. I looked at my father, comfortably certain he was right. I looked at my sister, perfect posture, perfect dress, perfect performance of a role she'd rehearsed since we were kids. And then I looked at the den, where the two best people I know sat at a table that wobbled every time Ethan moved his knee. Some moments arrive like storms. Some arrive like a single snowflake landing on your sleeve, weightless. But once you see it, you can't pretend the air is empty. I slid my chair back from the table. The scrape was soft, but every head turned. The chandelier hummed. The gravy boat gleamed. Somewhere in the kitchen, the pie cooled, and a tiny crack opened through the center, like a seam letting go. Selena, my mother said, voice low, warning, stitched through my name. Sit. Let's not make this into... I picked up the plate with the dark meat and the tide-line gravy and held it carefully so it wouldn't slosh onto the tablecloth. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. If I said one more word, I knew it would spill into 100 unsaid ones. The old ledger of slights and lessons, the way numbers add up even when you ignore them. Morgan watched me with her chin lifted a fraction, the way she does when she balances a thought that might change the picture she's drawing. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, as if a current had moved through the room and he wanted to feel it. The plate was heavy for what it held. I could feel the weight of it in my wrists. I could feel the weight of every Thanksgiving before this one, every time I smoothed the napkin and smiled and told my children to be good sports, because that's what kind people do. I set the plate down again on the sideboard by the window, where the afternoon light turned the glass into a long river across the hardwood. My reflection passed through the gravy boat, small and wavering. Mom, Ethan said, his voice barely above the drone's faint buzz. Are we eating now? I looked from my son to my daughter, from the oak table to the card table, from the chandelier's glow to the den's shadow. In my chest, something that had been obedient for 34 years uncrossed its hands and stood up. I took a breath that tasted like butter and clove, and the last day I would ever let this happen. And then, very quietly, so the crystal wouldn't tremble, I opened my mouth to answer. My mother's knife hadn't yet touched the turkey again when I finally spoke. The words came out calm, quieter than I expected, but they seemed to stop every other sound in the room. I told my children to get their things. No one moved for a moment. Amanda's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. My father's mouth opened, then closed. Ethan blinked at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. Get your backpacks, I said again, softer this time. We're leaving. My mother frowned, setting the carving knife down with a metallic clink. Selena, don't be ridiculous. It's Thanksgiving. Sit down and eat your dinner. I picked up Morgan's coat from the back of her chair and held out my hand. Not this Thanksgiving. Amanda gave a dry laugh. Oh, come on. You're really walking out over a plate of food. Her voice followed us as I helped the children into their jackets. The sound of it didn't make me angry anymore, It just felt small and tired, like a song I'd heard too many times. When we stepped outside, the air was cold enough to sting. The afternoon light was fading into that soft gold that comes just before dusk. I buckled Ethan into his booster seat and saw his lower lip tremble. "Mommy," he whispered. "Did we do something bad?" I bent down and looked him in the eyes. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. Some people just forget how to be kind." Morgan held her folder with the Thanksgiving card she'd made for her grandmother. She looked at it a long moment before setting it gently on the seat beside her. "Maybe she'll look at it later," she said, not quite believing her own words. The drive away from that house felt longer than it was. My phone kept lighting up with calls I didn't answer. The dashboard clock said 3:42. We hadn't eaten since breakfast. My stomach growled, but it wasn't hunger that made me shake. It was the quiet, how final it felt. A few miles down the highway, I pulled over and turned off the engine. I just needed a moment to breathe. Morgan watched the gray light fade through her window. "Are we still going to have Thanksgiving dinner?" she asked. "Yes," I said after a pause. "We just need to decide where." Ethan piped up from the back seat. "Can we get pie somewhere?" That small hope in his voice was what made me start the car again. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't take them home to sandwiches in silence. They deserved better than that. So I drove toward downtown where the lights were already flickering on in the shop windows. The Grand River Grill sat at the edge of the Riverwalk, its windows warm and fogged from the heat inside. I'd passed it hundreds of times, always assuming it was for people who didn't check their wallets before ordering. But when we stopped at a red light, I saw the reflection of my children in the glass, tired, hungry, but still waiting for me to decide what kind of night this would be. I turned into the parking lot. "Are we allowed to eat here?" Ethan asked, staring at the tall front doors. "We're allowed anywhere we're treated kindly," I said. "Come on." Inside, the restaurant glowed with candlelight. Soft jazz played low enough to feel like warmth instead of sound. A hostess greeted us with a polite smile. "Happy Thanksgiving," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," I admitted, just hoping for a small table. She looked down at her list, then up at my children. Their faces must have said enough. "We can make room," she said, taking 3 menus from the podium. "Follow me." She led us to a table by the window overlooking the dark river. Tiny lights from the bridge danced across the water. Morgan's eyes widened. "It looks like Christmas," she whispered. When the hostess left, Ethan leaned close to me. "This feels fancy," he said. "It is fancy," I told him, "and we're going to enjoy every minute of it." A young waitress came over with a notepad and an easy smile. "Hi there, I'm Sophia. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Would you like to hear about our Thanksgiving special?" "That sounds perfect," I said, trying to sound as though I wasn't mentally calculating my credit card balance. She crouched slightly to speak to the kids. "We also have sparkling cider in fancy glasses. Would you like to try that?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically. Morgan's smile was small but real. When Sophia left, Morgan rested her chin in her hand. "Grandma's table never looked like this," she said. I reached across and squeezed her fingers. Sometimes we don't realize how small a table is until we sit at a bigger one. The cider came in tall, fluted glasses that caught the light like something precious. The children clinked them together with quiet laughter. For the first time that day, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. Sophia returned with bread warm enough to steam when she broke it. "Looks like you've had a long day," she said gently. You could say that I answered. Family dinner didn't go as planned. She nodded knowingly. "Mine never do either," she said, setting down a dish of butter curls. "Hang in there." Her kindness, simple as it was, felt like a balm. Sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones that rebuild you. As we waited for our meal, the restaurant's manager passed our table. He stopped studying me for a moment. "Selena," he asked. "Selena Hart." I looked up surprised. His face clicked into memory after a second. "Michael Peterson," I said slowly. "From Jefferson High," he grinned. 16 years, and you still recognize me. How about that?" I laughed for the first time all day. "You look exactly the same, just better dressed." He smiled at the kids. "These yours?" "Yes," I said proudly. "Morgan and Ethan." "Well, it's a fine night to be out with family," he said. "Let me make sure you're taken care of." When the food came, it was more beautiful than I could have imagined. Slices of turkey glazed in honey mashed potatoes, so smooth they looked like clouds, cranberry compote, shining like jewels. For the first time in hours, I saw both of my children eat with joy. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait their turn. They just laughed and tasted and talked about which dessert sounded best. As I watched them, I realized how rare that sound had become. The restaurant around us faded to a hum. The reflection in the window looked like a different family altogether, still small, still learning, but standing in their own light. When dessert came, Michael returned carrying 3 plates instead of 2. "Pumpkin cheesecake," he announced, "and a little chocolate mousse on the side for our junior critics." Ethan's eyes widened. "We get both." Michael chuckled. "On the house. Happy Thanksgiving." I started to protest, but he waved me off. "Don't argue. I remember how hard you worked back in school. Consider it a reunion gift." Gratitude rose in my throat so thick I couldn't speak. I managed a nod. The cheesecake was creamy, the chocolate rich, but what stayed with me was the sound of my children's laughter echoing against the glass. For the first time that day, I didn't feel small. When I finally reached for my purse to pay, Michael stopped me again. "I won't take your card," he said gently. "Let me do this." "I can't let you." "You can," he said, meeting my eyes. "Sometimes people just deserve a good day." I sat back, overwhelmed by the grace of it. After all the cold stares and quiet insults, this simple kindness felt like a miracle. When we stepped outside, the air had turned crisp and still. The river reflected the city lights in long, unbroken streaks. Morgan tucked her hand into mine. "That was the best dinner ever," she said softly. Ethan was holding a small paper bag Sophia had slipped to him. "She said it's leftovers," he said proudly. "Turkey sandwiches for later." I smiled, blinking back tears. The good kind of leftovers this time. As we drove home, the world felt larger somehow. The windshield framed the city like a moving painting, people crossing streets, lights changing lives unfolding. I thought about the table we'd left behind, about the way silence had filled that house when I walked out. Maybe they were still talking about me. Maybe they'd moved on. It didn't matter. When we reached our small apartment, the children carried their paper bags to the kitchen and set them neatly on the counter. Morgan climbed onto her stool and began to draw at the table, sketching the river, the candles, and 3 tall glasses that sparkled like stars. Ethan curled up on the couch, his dinosaur backpack under his head. I made tea and stood at the window, watching snow begin to drift in soft white lines across the streetlight. My phone buzzed again, calls, messages, all from the same numbers I'd been ignoring. I turned it face down. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel obligated to answer. The clock ticked past 9. The kids were already asleep when I checked on them. Morgan's drawing lay beside her pillow, a crayon sun rising over the river. In the corner, she'd written 3 small words in her uneven handwriting, "Our Thanksgiving now." I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, listening to their breathing, thinking about everything that had just changed. The night had started with shame and ended with peace. The house was small, but the air inside it felt open light and alive. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing the day's footprints from the world. I thought of my mother's voice saying efficient, of Amanda's laughter, of my father's calm cruelty. Those echoes had always felt like walls. Tonight, they were just noise fading into distance. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the streetlight's reflection on the floor. For the first time in years, I slept without the feeling that I had to apologize for existing. And somewhere between dreams, I realized something simple and true. Sometimes walking away isn't leaving, it's arriving. The first light of morning slipped through the blinds, faint and silvery. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me, the soft hum of the heater, or the quiet sense that something inside me had shifted overnight. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee grounds from the night before, and somewhere down the hall, a child's laugh broke into a yawn. When I stepped into the kitchen, Morgan was sitting at the table coloring in the drawing she'd made of the restaurant by the river. She'd added stars in the sky and a golden glow in the windows. Ethan was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, his hair standing in a dozen directions. The calm in the room felt new, fragile, like something that might vanish if I breathed too loudly. We had nowhere to be that day. The restaurant leftovers sat neatly labeled in the fridge, and the phone I'd silenced last night blinked with unread messages. I didn't touch it. Instead, I made pancakes from a mix we'd had tucked in the pantry and poured the last of the syrup over 3 plates. Morgan and Ethan ate quietly, still sleepy, but content. Halfway through breakfast, Ethan looked up. "Mom, are we going back to Grandma and Grandpa's for Christmas?" The question hung between us. I looked at their hopeful faces, then at the sunlight sliding across the table. "I don't know yet," I said, honestly. "We'll see." After they finished eating, I washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands. My reflection in the window looked different, somehow older maybe, but steadier. The fear I used to feel after standing up to my parents wasn't there this time. What I felt instead was a quiet certainty that I'd done what needed to be done. By afternoon, I was back at work. Numbers on a screen were simpler than people. They lined up when you told them to. I focused on invoices and statements until the ache in my chest softened into something manageable. The phone buzzed again around 3. My mother's name glowed across the display. I watched it ring, then let it fade to silence. That evening, after I tucked the kids into bed, I sat with a cup of tea by the window and finally opened the messages. My father had sent 3 short clipped, each one colder than the last. "You embarrassed your mother. You ruined Thanksgiving. We expect an apology." Then came one from Amanda. "The least you could do is answer. Mom is heartbroken. You should fix this before Christmas." I scrolled through them all, feeling nothing but fatigue. For years, those words would have shaken me, sent me racing to defend myself or smooth things over. But this time, I just turned the phone off again. A week passed before I heard from any of them in person. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray sky and drizzle, the kind of day that makes time move slower. The receptionist buzzed my office. "Selena, there's someone here to see you. Says his name's Thomas Wilson, Amanda's husband." I almost told her to send him away, but curiosity got the better of me. When he walked in, Thomas looked out of place in my small office dark suit. Polished shoes, the scent of expensive cologne that didn't belong in a space filled with paper and old coffee. "Thanks for seeing me," he said, sitting across from my desk. He looked uncomfortable, like a man rehearsing lines he didn't want to say. What can I do for you, Thomas? He cleared his throat. I wanted to talk about Thanksgiving. If you're here to convince me to apologize, you're wasting your time. He shook his head. No. Actually, I came to say you were right. That caught me off guard. I leaned back in my chair. Excuse me? He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. What your parents did, what Amanda did, it was wrong. I should have said something that night. I didn't. I just sat there. I studied his face, trying to decide if I believed him. He looked tired, older than I remembered. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't stop thinking about it, he said quietly. The way your father talked about your kids, the look on Morgan's face. I keep seeing it. I didn't know what to say. Thomas had always been polite but distant, the kind of man who stayed out of family tension as long as it didn't reach his doorstep. Seeing guilt on his face was new. Amanda and I argued about it, he went on. She said you were being dramatic, that you always play the victim. I told her I didn't agree. She didn't take that well. I almost smiled, but the weight of the conversation kept me still. So you're here to apologize? Yes, and to offer help. He pulled a checkbook from his jacket. For the kids, or anything you might need. I pushed it back toward him. No, Thomas. I don't need money. I just needed someone to stand up for what was right, and you couldn't do that when it mattered. He looked down at the checkbook, then slowly nodded. You're right about that, too. He stood to leave, then hesitated at the door. Zoe asked why Morgan and Ethan left without saying goodbye. When I told her what happened, she cried. Said she never meant to make them feel bad. His voice softened. Kids only know what we teach them. When he was gone, I sat for a long while, staring at the rain on the glass. It felt strange hearing remorse from someone who'd sat at that shining table silent while the rest of them laughed. Part of me wanted to be angry again, but mostly, I just felt tired. Still, there was something about his visit that lingered like a small crack of light through a door. Maybe it meant change was possible, even if it came from the least expected corner. Later that evening, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a familiar voice greeted me. Selena. It's Michael Peterson from the restaurant. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I smiled, surprised. Hi, Michael. Not at all. I wanted to follow up about something we talked about, he said. You mentioned you're an accountant. Our restaurant group is expanding and could really use someone with your skills. Would you be interested in meeting about it? I looked around my small, cluttered office. Yes, I said slowly. I'd like that very much. We arranged to meet later that week. When I walked into the Grand River Grill again on Friday afternoon, the air smelled faintly of rosemary and warm bread. Michael greeted me with that same easy smile. You look less tired than the last time I saw you, he said kindly. I've been sleeping a little better, I admitted. He led me upstairs to an office overlooking the river. Papers covered the desk, and the sound of kitchen clatter rose faintly through the floor. We're opening 2 more locations next year, he explained. The current accountant is retiring. We'd love for you to take over. The offer he laid out was better than anything I could have imagined. Steady hours, health insurance, enough pay to quit my night job. For the first time in years, the numbers actually worked in my favor. When I accepted, his smile widened. Welcome to the team, he said, shaking my hand. That night, I came home with takeout from the grill, real food, still warm. I told Morgan and Ethan the news as they unwrapped the containers at our small table. Morgan's eyes lit up. You mean you'll be home at night now? Yes, I said, watching her grin. No more double shifts. Ethan raised his fork like a tiny toast. Then this is the best dinner ever again. Their laughter filled the kitchen, bright and easy. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that sound. Over the next few weeks, everything began to shift in small, quiet ways. Mornings weren't rushed anymore. I could walk the kids to school instead of dropping them off in a hurry. We started making pancakes on Sundays and watching old movies on Fridays. The apartment still wasn't big, but it finally felt like home. Around mid-December, my mother called again. This time, her voice sounded different, softer, almost uncertain. "Selena," she said, "your father and I have been thinking about what happened. Maybe we should talk." I didn't answer right away. I looked across the room at my children building a blanket fort, their laughter spilling into every corner. "We can talk," I said at last, "but it will be on my terms." After I hung up, I sat for a long moment listening to the steady hum of the heater and the quiet joy of my children's play. I didn't know what the conversation with my parents would bring, or if real change was possible. But for the first time, I felt ready to find out. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, tracing soft white lines against the window pane. I stood there, watching it gather, each flake silent but sure, until the city below looked clean and new. And somewhere, deep inside, I felt the same. The day my father called, the air outside was brittle with December cold. Frost lined the edges of the window, and the radio murmured something soft in the background. One of those slow Christmas songs that always sound a little lonely. When I answered, his voice carried the weight of something I hadn't heard from him before. It wasn't anger this time. It was uncertainty. "Selena," he said, clearing his throat. "Your mother and we'd like to see you. And the kids." I stood at the sink, my hands in warm dishwater. The sound of Morgan and Ethan laughing in the living room felt impossibly far away. "Why now?" I asked quietly. "We miss you," he said. "We need to talk." There was a pause long enough for me to hear the hum of the refrigerator. "Not at the house," I said finally. "Somewhere neutral." He didn't argue. "The park, by our place." Saturday, I agreed before I could think too much about it. After we hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time, waiting for the usual guilt to creep in. It didn't. What I felt instead was a small, steady pulse of calm. That Saturday morning was clear and cold, the kind of winter light that makes everything look sharper. Morgan and Ethan wore their new coats, the ones I'd been able to buy without checking price tags twice. As we walked toward the park, I told them the truth. "We're meeting Grandma and Grandpa," I said. "We'll see how it goes. You don't have to do or say anything you don't want to." Ethan slipped his hand into mine. "What if they're still mean?" "Then we leave," I said. "But we'll know we tried." Morgan walked beside me, her mittens tucked under her arms. "We're a team," she said softly, and I nodded. My parents were already there, sitting on a bench near the swings. The sight of them startled me. My mother's hair, once perfectly kept, had flattened under a wool hat. My father looked smaller, shoulders curved inward, his gloves clutched tightly in his hands. When they saw us, my mother rose but didn't step forward right away. "Selena," she said, voice trembling a little. "Children. Mom. Dad." I stopped a few feet away, giving them space to decide how close they wanted this to be. Morgan and Ethan half hid behind me. My mother's eyes darted between them, then back to me. "We've missed you," she said again, as if repetition could make it truer. We all sat down together on the cold, wooden bench. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the swings and a distant bark from someone's dog. My father was the first to speak. "We've thought a lot about Thanksgiving," he said, his breath showing in small clouds. "And about how we've treated you and the kids. It was wrong." I watched his face carefully. It wasn't just Thanksgiving, I said. It's been every year, every visit, every small reminder that we were worth less. He nodded once slow. My mother's eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. We didn't see it that way, she said. But that doesn't mean we weren't wrong. She reached into the large tote bag at her feet and pulled out 2 wrapped gifts, small, neat, with silver bows. These are for the children. We wanted to give them something special for Christmas. Morgan looked to me for permission. I nodded. She and Ethan unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside were gifts that made my throat tighten: real art supplies for Morgan, a dinosaur excavation kit for Ethan. Nothing showy, nothing cheap. Just right. Thank you, they both said politely. My mother smiled, fragile and relieved. We're trying to do better, she said, folding her hands in her lap. To understand. I took a slow breath. If we're going to try again, I said, it has to be different. No more separate tables, no different rules for who deserves what. My children will be treated equally. That's not negotiable. My father's jaw tightened, but then he nodded. We understand. And Amanda? I asked. They exchanged a glance. My mother sighed. She doesn't agree. Thomas does, though. He told us about your new job. We're proud of you, Selena. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Those words, so simple, so late, felt heavier than any apology. I nodded. Thank you. Ethan tugged my hand. Can we go play now? Go ahead, I said. They ran to the swings, their laughter cutting through the winter air. My mother watched them with watery eyes. I want to know them, she said quietly. Really know them. I studied her face, the fine lines at her eyes, the way guilt had settled there like shadow. Then show them, I said. Every time. We sat a while longer, not saying much, letting the air between us settle. When we finally stood to leave, my father reached out awkwardly and touched my shoulder. Maybe you could host Christmas this year, he said. I looked at him surprised. At my place? He nodded. We'd like that, if you'll have us. I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. All right, I said, but you come as guests, not as judges. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. Fair enough. That evening, as the kids told me how many times they'd gone down the slide before we left, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a cautious hope. Maybe not everything was broken beyond repair. The next week was a flurry of quiet preparations. I cleaned the apartment, borrowed an extra folding table, and found a small string of white lights at the thrift store to hang in the window. Michael stopped by one evening with a basket of ingredients. If you'll let me, he said, I'd love to help cook on Christmas Day. The warmth in his smile made something gentle move inside me. I'd like that, I said. On Christmas morning, the city lay under a thin layer of snow, soft and glittering. Morgan and Ethan woke before sunrise, their excitement shaking the walls. The gifts under the tree weren't extravagant books, mittens, a small stuffed owl, but they were chosen with love, and that made them enough. By noon, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Thomas stood there, holding a box of gifts and wearing an uncertain smile. Behind him were his 3 children, Zoe, Tyler, and little Lily, all bundled up in bright scarves. Is it all right if we come in? He asked. Of course, I said, stepping aside. Zoe found Morgan almost immediately. I overheard her whisper something that made Morgan's eyes shine an apology, or maybe just a quiet start over. Tyler crouched beside Ethan's toy dinosaurs, asking questions about the names, genuinely curious this time. And Lily threw her arms around my legs. I missed you, Aunt Selena, she said. Thomas handed me a small box. For you, he said simply. Inside was a silver bracelet, a single charm shaped like a bird taking flight. A card tucked underneath read, "For new beginnings." I met his eyes and nodded. "Thank you." A short while later, my parents arrived, bundled in heavy coats and carrying dishes still warm from the oven. My mother looked around the apartment with an expression somewhere between nostalgia and disbelief. My father set a casserole on the counter and gave a short nod. We ate together at 2 tables, pushed side by side, the same mismatched plates that once embarrassed me now feeling like proof of something earned. The food wasn't perfect, but the laughter sounded easy. When my mother passed the rolls, she made sure every child had one before serving herself. After dinner, Morgan showed her grandmother the picture she'd drawn weeks earlier, the restaurant by the river, the 3 of us at the window. My mother studied it, eyes misting over. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "I'd like to frame it if you'll let me." Morgan beamed, proud and shy, all at once. Later, as twilight painted the room in gold and gray, Michael joined us. He fit into the evening, as if he'd always been part of it, telling stories that made even my father laugh. When dessert was served, my mother leaned across the table. "You seem happy, Selena," she said. "I am," I answered, and for the first time, I truly meant it. When everyone left that night, the children drowsy, the adults full and quiet, I stood by the window and watched the snow begin again. The apartment was messy, the dishes piled high, but peace lingered in the air, like something sacred. Morgan wandered out in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "was today okay?" "It was better than okay," I said, pulling her close. It was the beginning of something new. She nodded sleepily. "Grandma said, next time we'll all sit at one table again." I smiled. "Yes," I said. "That's how it should be." She went back to bed, and I stayed by the window a little longer. The lights from the street reflected against the snow, turning everything soft and quiet. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of old wounds lift just enough to breathe. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not completely. But it was a step toward it, and that was enough for now. By the time spring arrived, the snow outside our apartment had melted into soft rivulets that glimmered beneath the streetlights. The air smelled faintly of rain and budding trees, and the nights had grown quieter in a way that felt healing. The memories of that chaotic Thanksgiving no longer felt sharp. They were still there, etched into the story of who we were, but they'd lost their sting like a scar you can touch without wincing. On weekday mornings, I woke before the children. The apartment was still and blue with early light. I would make coffee and listen to the hum of the city waking up. The small things that used to feel like burdens, packing lunches, ironing shirts, checking homework, had become tiny rituals of peace. Each one reminded me of how far we'd come from that folding table in the corner of my parents' house. Morgan was blooming. Her art supplies had taken over one end of the kitchen table, and most evenings she could be found there painting small, careful scenes, sunsets over rivers, bright skies with birds in flight. Ethan would sit nearby explaining the dinosaurs she should add to her pictures, his imagination still as fierce as his laughter. Sometimes I'd stop in the doorway and just watch them, feeling a kind of fullness that didn't need words. My new position at the restaurant group had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The work challenged me, but in a way that built me rather than broke me. Michael's office was just down the hall from mine, and his steady kindness had become something I leaned on quietly. We started sharing lunch breaks, trading stories about our families and childhood memories of the same small town. It was never rushed or forced, just 2 people who understood the quiet work of rebuilding a life. One Friday afternoon, after a long week of closing reports, Michael stopped by my desk with 2 cups of coffee. "You ever think about how far you've come since that Thanksgiving?" he asked. I smiled, stirring my cup. Sometimes. Mostly, I think about how different peace feels from silence. He tilted his head. What's the difference? Silence is what I used to survive, I said softly. Peace is what I chose. He nodded, understanding, without needing to say anything more. As the weeks passed, my parents began visiting regularly. Never unannounced. Always with a phone call first. The visits were small at first, an hour here, a Sunday lunch there. My mother would bring a pie or a puzzle for the kids. My father still struggled with words, but I noticed the small things, the way he helped Ethan assemble his model airplane, or the way his hand would rest gently on Morgan's shoulder when he praised her drawings. He was trying, and for the first time, I believed it. Amanda stayed distant. She sent a card at Easter with her children's school photos and a note that said, "Hope you're well." It was polite, nothing more. I didn't chase it. I'd stopped expecting understanding from her, and somehow that was its own kind of freedom. I'd learned that not every relationship needed repairing, some only needed release. By early summer, the children and I had built new traditions. Friday nights were for homemade pizza with flour dusting the counter and laughter echoing through the kitchen. Saturdays often found us at the park by the river, feeding ducks and watching the sunset over the water. Occasionally, Michael joined us, bringing sandwiches from the restaurant or a kite for Ethan to fly. There was an ease to those afternoons that I hadn't known could exist. One evening, as the sun slipped low and turned the water gold, Morgan set her sketch pad aside and said, "Mom, do you think Grandma and Grandpa understand now?" I thought about it for a moment. "I think they're trying," I said. "And sometimes that's enough." Ethan looked up from the grass where he was lining up pebbles. "I'm glad you didn't let them make us eat the leftovers." His words made me smile. "Me too, sweetheart. Everyone deserves a full plate." That night, after the children were asleep, I sat on the balcony with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The city murmured below, and somewhere in the distance, a train horn drifted through the warm air. I thought about how much had changed, not just around me, but within me. I no longer measured my worth by what others offered. I no longer waited for permission to be treated well. The next morning, I received a call from my mother. Her voice sounded lighter than usual. "Your father and I were wondering," she said, "if we could take the kids to the museum this weekend. There's an art exhibit and we thought Morgan might enjoy it." I hesitated, then smiled. "She would love that," I said. "Thank you for thinking of her." When they arrived that Saturday, my father stood in the doorway holding a bouquet of daisies. He handed them to me without a word. The gesture was small, but it said everything he couldn't. I placed them in a glass jar on the table and watched as Morgan and Ethan pulled on their shoes, chattering with excitement. My mother hugged me briefly before they left. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was human. With the apartment quiet again, I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window. Outside, the day was bright and open, full of life. I realized that the peace I'd wanted all along wasn't about having a perfect family or rewriting the past. It was about knowing that I could stand in my own light and still let others find their way to it when they were ready. Later that week, Michael invited us to the restaurant for a small celebration. The company had expanded again, and he wanted to thank the team. I brought Morgan and Ethan, who wore their best clothes and behaved like seasoned dinner guests. As we sat together in the same dining room where everything had begun months earlier, I looked around the table, friends, laughter, warmth, and felt something inside me settle completely. Michael raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said. Morgan leaned toward me and whispered, "This feels like Thanksgiving all over again." I smiled. "It does," I said. "But this time, everyone eats together." After dinner, we stepped outside. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from the flower beds along the river. The street lamps shimmered on the water, just like that first night when everything had changed. Ethan took my hand. Morgan slipped her arm around my waist. Michael walked quietly beside us. As we crossed the bridge, I thought about how far life had come from that cold November day. What began as humiliation had become strength. What once broke me had taught me how to stand without apology. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with an apology or a grand gesture. It comes quietly in the sound of laughter at your own table, in the peace of knowing you've given your children something better than you had. I paused at the middle of the bridge, watching the lights ripple across the dark water. The city was alive, but around us, it felt still, like the world was giving us a moment to breathe. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive. They fade because we finally let go. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever found peace by walking away from what hurt you, tell me how it changed you. And if you'd like more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the families we build for ourselves, stay close. There's always room here for a full plate and for the peace we all deserve.